At 9 a.m. on October 21st, the pilots of the planes at Mabalacat took off on hearing a report of an American force east of Leyte Island. But the weather was bad, and when they got to the scene, they saw nothing but miles of empty sea, so they turned back and returned safely. Then at 3 p.m. that same day, in the operations room of the Kamikaze unit stationed at Cebu Island, the telephone rang, and a voice reported an enemy task force built around 6 carriers that was sighted 60 miles east of Suluan Island. The Japanese were ready to launch a suicide mission when a force of American fighters and bombers appeared over the mountains, swooped down on the field, and destroyed all the Japanese planes ready to take off. 3 more planes were hauled from revetments, and a mission was organized to take off at 4:25 p.m. Led by Lieutenant Yoshiyasu Kuno, the 3 planes flew into the uncertain weather and even more uncertain future they would face over Leyte Gulf. On October 21st, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was keeping a sharp eye out for the Japanese, for there had been sightings of major Japanese ships on the previous day, and Halsey was itching for a chance to knock off the Japanese fleet if it ventured into Philippine waters. Admiral Bogan's planes and Admiral Sherman's planes swept southern Luzon and the Visayas that day and attacked Coron Bay. They moved out to the north and northwest, searching, but did not find anything. The pickings were slim indeed. Meanwhile, Admiral McCain's group and Admiral Davidson's group fueled that day, making sure that half the fighting force of carriers was topped off and ready for anything. The jeep or escort carriers were busy all day, guarding, sweeping, and fueling. They began at 5:30 a.m. with a launch of combat air patrol planes, with fueling coming half an hour later. They were careful. The fueling of the Suwannee was interrupted by a raid alarm at 6:35 a.m., but 45 minutes later nothing had happened, and fueling was resumed. At 11:16 a.m., word came that a friendly plane had been shot down by trigger-happy gunners in the fleet. It was a photo plane from the carrier Petrov Bay, and the shooters were aboard a landing ship tank on the beach. Luckily, though the plane was lost, all members of the crew were rescued. It was an easy day for the escort carriers, comparatively speaking. They struck nearby airfields and dumps and equipment and came back and landed, and other planes struck some more. They shot down 4 planes in the air and destroyed 23 on the ground, with another 8 claimed as probables. The photo plane and 1 other were both shot down by friendly fire, and that was the extent of the losses of the escort carriers. The landings were going beautifully. The troops were moving steadily inland from both landing areas. Dagami and Tacloban airfields were captured this day, and Tacloban, which had dock facilities, was also captured, although here the Japanese staged a futile counterattack. The ships were unloading and moving out, and other ships were on their way from Hollandia, bringing supplies and reinforcements of various kinds. But there was another ship casualty that day, and it came shortly after dawn at 5:30 a.m., just as the escort carriers were launching their air patrols. 3 Japanese planes appeared out of the murk and headed for the northern attack force of Admiral Barbe. They came in close and strafed HMAS Australia. The anti-aircraft guns of the fleet began to rattle and pop, and 1 Japanese plane went down, then another, cartwheeling and splashing into the sea, oily smoke marking the graves of the pilots. Then the 3rd plane came in zooming. It smashed into the foremast of the Australia, bounced into her bridge, and killed Captain E.F.V. Deschaneux. On seeing the chief of the Australian forces present, for this was his flagship, was Commodore John A. Collins, and he and 53 others aboard the ship were wounded by the crashing plane. The bridge blazed fiercely, and the sheer legs of the mast broke. She was lying near the Blue Ridge, and in a few minutes Barbie had his doctor aboard the Australian cruiser and was giving all the medical aid possible, but she was out of action. Later that day, a little convoy was formed of the Australia, the Honolulu, the American destroyer Richard P. Leary, and the Australian HMAS Warramunga, headed for Manus and repairs. The day went on uneventfully, as invasion days would go at sea. The soldiers were fighting fiercely on the land, and by 4 p.m., General Seibert relieved Admiral Barbie of command of the northern troop operations. That meant he was well assured, established, and confident of maintaining his position. The Japanese had set out to try to stop the Americans on the beaches. They had already failed on D+1, October 21st, to achieve that aim of their one big battle strategy. As for the brave sacrifice of Lieutenant Yoshiyasu Kuno, who took off late in the afternoon from Cebu, intending to crash an American carrier, it came to nothing at all. There were air raids at 4:35 p.m. and again around 7 p.m. in the twilight, which may have been the Kamikaze attackers. Planes came in 9 miles off the starboard quarter of the Blue Ridge, and the ships laid smoke and began firing with their 5-inch and 40 guns. Landing craft infantry went upwind to make more smoke. The Japanese came in again on the port side as darkness fell, and the red tracers made a fireworks display in the sky. But Lieutenant Kuno was never seen again. October 22nd was a relatively quiet day. The escort carriers were alert to their responsibility, and it did not seem too much for them. They flew their missions, but all day long they shot down only 1 Japanese plane in the air and 9 on the ground. There was one odd report of a plane that seemed to be a TBM, an American patrol bomber, that was attacking ships in Leyte Gulf. This was written off as a captured plane being used by the enemy. In the morning there was an enemy air raid on the beaches, and the intelligence officers felt indications of strengthening Japanese resistance. But it had not yet shown itself on the sea or in the air. Rather, it was in the determination of the Japanese fighters ashore. That day, at La Hogue, Japanese aircraft gunners shot down 4 American planes, and 5 others were shot up but managed to make it back to their ships. Ashore, everything was going well. Reinforcements moved in, and all the army forces were making progress in moving toward their objectives. General MacArthur had made a token landing on October 20th on Red Beach, and then gone back to the Louisville to wait until matters were secure enough for his headquarters to be established ashore. It seemed to be just a matter of days. General Walter Kruger, his land commander, was remaining aboard Admiral Kinkaid's flagship because the communications were so good there, but he too expected to be ashore in a matter of hours. Admiral McCain and Admiral Davidson and their carrier groups of the Third Fleet were heading for Ulithi Atoll to reprovision and rearm. They had been fighting for almost 2 weeks. In fact, the whole of Task Force 38 was tired, and the pilots particularly were nearly exhausted, and the carriers needed replenishment. Just about everyone needed a few good nights of rest. McCain's group was tired too, and it had other problems as well. On the big carrier, for example, Captain A.K. Doyle had taken aboard a new Air Group 11, on October 1st, and 9 days later the group was in action. Although the weather on the way to Okinawa had been so foul that the group had averaged only 1.5 practice landings per pilot, it is doubtful, said the captain, if any new carrier group has ever been thrown so abruptly into such violent operations. Certainly battleships are not given green turret crews 8 days before action. Another problem was the rapid expansion of the Navy air arm. The coming of ever more new carriers to the Pacific was having an effect not unlike that of the Japanese in their heavy losses. It had resulted in what Captain Doyle called the thinning out of experienced personnel, to a point where experienced flight leaders are few. The Hornets Air Group commander had been killed over Formosa, and it hurt badly. There was a problem of pilot training here too. One day, a green pilot came in and was waved off, and he had not put down his landing hook. He came around again and still did not put down his landing hook. The desperate landing officer finally ran up the deck with a spare landing hook in hand and engaged it on a wire so that the youngster could see what he was supposed to do. Then, and only then, did he remember to drop his hook. While this provided entertainment for the crew, said Captain Doyle, it indicated poor indoctrination of pilots. The Hornet and the rest of the Third Fleet had had a rough time. Admiral Halsey was giving all the punishment he could to the Japanese. There had been no respite for the pilots. After the Formosa fight and the strikes on central Luzon on October 20th, they had gone right in to hit northern Mindanao and the Davao area. In their sweep, they had found no opposition and only 5 Japanese planes to strafe. In their bombing strikes, They had seen so many friendly planes that they found it hard to get to the target and drop in the designated area. So it had come as a great bit of news to the Hornet that she was to head back to Ulithi. In Flag Plot of the New Jersey, where Admiral Halsey held forth, there was a certain uneasiness, a feeling that the Japanese ought to come out and fight, but nothing very definite. The reports of Japanese ships zigzagging around the inland sea made them worry, and they turned over various plans of action in their minds. In Leyte Gulf, General MacArthur was waiting with as much patience as he could muster for the troops to consolidate their positions so that he might move ashore permanently. General Kruger remained on Kinkaid's flagship, and Kinkaid himself was attending to the business of keeping things moving the way he wanted them to. 2 days earlier, south in Borneo, Admiral Kurita laid his final plans for the movement that was to destroy the Americans once and for all. Because of the shortage of aircraft, Kurita's intelligence was anything but good. On October 20th, with hundreds of American ships in Leyte Gulf and outside ranging the perimeter, the Japanese combined reports listed only 41 transports, 10 carriers, 6 destroyers, and 44 other ships in the whole area. The Japanese must have known there were far more ships, but they showed a remarkable capacity for courage, complete disregard of danger, and self-deception. Vice Admiral Mataki was Kurita's commander of Battleship Division 1, which centered around the big modern battleships Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato, on which the Japanese placed so much hope in this operation. If, as Admiral Kinkaid said with a shudder, a pair of cruisers infiltrating into Leyte Gulf could wreak havoc like a fox in a henhouse, then what might not battleships with 18-inch guns do? Admiral Ugaki had high hopes, and of all the Japanese commanders, few were closer to the conduct of the naval war than Admiral Ugaki had been. He was Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff from the outbreak of the war until the day that Yamamoto was ambushed in the South Pacific. Now he held a command with as responsible a job as he could have wished. On October 20th, in spite of what had happened at Formosa in the air battle, in spite of the confusion that Ugaki must have sensed in the Philippines and at home, he was determinedly optimistic. Here is his view of the war situation at that moment. In view of the present situation, 1st Air Fleet has organized the Kamikaze Special Attack Units with the 26 fighters, the entire present strength, with 13 to be employed for crash attacks of the 2001st Air Group. These planes, which have been divided into 4 units, will, in the event the enemy carriers appear east of the Philippines, destroy the carriers, or at least make them unusable for the time being. These battle results, it is said, are anticipated before the surface ships penetrate. What exalted spirit! Not even an enemy who is 1 million strong or has 1,000 carriers need be feared. This is because all forces are equally of this spirit. Yesterday, it is reported that a mass victory rally was held at Hibiya Park, Tokyo, for the purpose of strengthening the unity of the homeland. If the 100 million citizens should immediately firmly adopt this sacrificial spirit and apply it to production and defense, who would have fears about the future of our empire? At present, the United States is engrossed in the presidential election. Dewey supposedly has a slight edge. There is no need to fear an enemy whose war objective and operational direction are motivated by self-interest. Buoyed by such thoughts, Admiral Ugaki boarded the Otago, Admiral Kinkaid's flagship, for last-minute discussions. He was calm and confident. On the day before heading for Brunei, the weather had been fine, even better just after the announcement of the activation of the show plan. His seamen had captured a hawk, which alighted on the main battery control station. It was a good omen, and it was announced over the public address system of the ship to raise the morale of all. The bird had been placed in a cage on the bridge, and would be kept as a symbol of victory for the show operation. Then, on the evening before entering Brunei, the ship had been bathed in a sea of phosphorescence. Such brilliance augured well for victory. As Admiral Ugaki moved to that flagship in his barge, the destroyers and cruisers were around his battleships fueling. This was the Japanese system, particularly now in the 3rd year of the war, when the shortage of tankers and trained crews was so great that refueling from tankers at sea was all but impossible. Thus, the big ships kept their smaller companions fueled and took on resupply from the tankers in port. The tankers were due in on the 21st to refill the battleships. The friendly Zeros and seaplanes of the fleet and the land-based air force at Singapore flew overhead, the red rising sun on wings and tails giving a comforting feeling to those below. There had been 2 submarine scares during the day, but only one of them was apparently real. The admirals worried lest a force of big bombers from the Marianas might appear and smash them at anchorage. Admiral Kincaid's conference lasted until 10 p.m., and then the ship commanders and force leaders moved back to their own vessels. Admiral Ugaki went back to the Yamato, his flagship, and had his dinner. Then he began his own staff preparations. That evening, Admiral Ugaki called the commanders of his ships to the Yamato. They discussed the coming sailing and the operation until he was sure that every commander knew exactly what he and Kurita had in mind. A staff officer of the Japanese 14th Area Army appeared before the group and gave a map briefing on the situation in the Tacloban area after the American landings. It was true that the Americans had come ashore against virtually no opposition, but the 16th Division was held back for just such a defence, said the staff officer, and it was planning a counterattack as soon as the Kurita force could cause havoc among the ships on the beach and cut off the American resupply and line of retreat. During the night, the refuelling continued. The oilers Makaru and Uaru came in from Singapore and were put to work. Then, at 8 a.m., the Kurita force moved out. Admiral Kurita had many problems on his mind. He had very little concept of what kind of air defence he could expect from the land-based forces in the Philippines. He expected to meet a very strong surface force, no matter whether or not Admiral Ozawa was successful in luring the enemy north. It was quite conceivable to Kurita that he could lose half his force of 32 ships in the coming engagement. There were 3 possible routes for Admiral Kurita to take, and he considered all of them. The first was the southern route from Borneo up near Morai, but this would bring him under possible air attacks from land-based planes of the American air forces. The second route was to go north and cut around down into the Philippines, but he rejected this plan as too expensive in fuel. For in everything he did, he had to consider the problems of fuel and fuel resupply. The tankers available to him were at Brunei and at Coron Bay, if they had not been sunk by this time. 2 tankers were coming from the Singapore base to the Sulu Sea. The third approach, the one Admiral Kurita chose, would take him through Palawan Passage. He knew the dangers, and they were great. The Americans were operating submarines in the region, and he was quite likely to come under attack before he ever reached the passage. But he chose this route as the greatest in opportunity and the least in danger as far as the overall picture went. He headed for that narrow body of water between Palawan Island and the region known as the Dangerous Ground because of its reefs and shallows, which extends into the South China Sea. Kurita was not wrong in his estimate of the American coverage of the central area of approach. As of October 20th, the American submarine forces of the 7th Fleet were very much on the alert for the possible coming of enemy ships. The Cod, which had expended all its torpedoes in recent days, still remained at sea instead of going back to base as would normally be expected, for she was to make reconnaissance north of Lingayen Gulf. The Bream and Gar covered the west and northwest approaches to Manila. The Anger and Bluegill covered the southwest approaches to Manila and Verde Island Passage. The Rock and Burgull patrolled on a line between Cape Varela and the northwest corner of the Dangerous Ground. The Data was covering the southern entrance to Palawan Passage, and the Dace was covering the western approaches to Balabac Straits. The Hammerhead was covering the southwest approaches to Brunei Bay, and the Gurnard was moving up to help her. The Lionfish was east of Coron Bay, waiting for those tankers, and the Raton was southbound in the Sulu Sea, where she might catch the other tankers. The Paddle was assigned to Balikpapan on lifeguard duty to save American airmen who might be downed. The Batfish was headed for patrol in the eastern Sulu Sea. HMS Tantivy was patrolling the lower Makassar Strait, HMS Stoic was in the Java Sea, and HMS Storm patrolled east of Celebes Strait, while HMS Spur was patrolling the southern approaches to Sunda Strait. What Admiral Ugaki and his companions did not seem to understand was that if, at home in the United States, Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Dewey were competing for control of the American government out in the Pacific. Thousands of dedicated young men had nothing more important on their minds than the destruction of this Japanese fleet. In fact, all Japanese vessels that might come within sight were not receiving the assistance from land-based air that Admiral Shard had hoped for. An example of this was the conduct of the 5th Attack Unit of the 752nd Air Group. According to the plans for the show operation, this unit was to move to the Philippines stock and barrel on October 22nd. However, as the planes began arriving, commanders discovered that the expected arrangements for the landing of combat planes and the transport of ground personnel had not been made. Most of the planes reached the Clark Field area about sundown on the 22nd, causing serious confusion in the air traffic pattern. Many of them were diverted to unfamiliar fields, and some ground crews were also diverted. What was supposed to be an orderly move to the front became a confused mess that had to be sorted out before the unit could begin operating as a cohesive force. Since the success of the show operation depended on precise timing, the operation was already in trouble. On October 23rd, the mess had not been resolved by midnight of that second day. Despite this, Admiral Kurita sailed with his force at 8 a.m. on October 22nd from Brunei Bay. It was a cloudy day, and the wind riffled the white caps on the waves, offering no help for visual submarine watches. However, the big ships had radar and sound gear to track the enemy if he appeared. They moved out at 18 knots from the broad reaches of the beautiful bay and began zigzagging independently within their formations. Admiral Kurita had to make a difficult decision regarding routes. There were 3 possible ones in the Palawan region. One would take them down the west side of Palawan Island and near the dangerous ground to Mindoro Strait. A second would go through the dangerous ground, and a third down the east side of Palawan Island. The most dangerous route concerning submarine attacks was the approach via the west side of the island, as supply ships could not reach other approaches in time to be of any use to the fleet. They moved between 16 and 18 knots, with the weather changing from better to cloudy again. The intelligence they received was still far from accurate, and they had heard that enemy forces had landed on Rapu-Rapu Island, north of San Bernardino Strait. If that report was true, their plans were in jeopardy. The Americans would know as soon as they passed by and give the warning, leaving no chance of achieving a surprise attack. However, before the despair of abandoning their plans could set in, comforting news arrived that the landings had not occurred, and that faulty intelligence was to blame. Admiral Kurita heaved a sigh of relief. The effect of such erroneous reports at a time like this was significant. The tension was growing. In the morning, intelligence from late reports indicated ships in the Gulf, with a later report putting the figure at around 100. The Japanese realized they would face a strong force, and land fighting was fierce around Taban, with heavy Japanese losses. However, any wavering in the fleet was silenced by a message from the Emperor. Our army and navy forces working in close unity have intercepted the enemy fleet and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy by engaging him in fierce battle. I hereby express my deep gratitude. The admirals and lesser officers did not need to delve beneath the surface of this uninformative message. The reason for it was apparent. The situation was becoming increasingly urgent by the day. The Emperor demanded that they succeed on behalf of the people of the homeland, who worshipped the Emperor as a god. The men of the Navy needed no more than this message to understand that they must return with their ships, or not return at all. Poor Kurita, feeling the need for air cover, had been stripped of his float reconnaissance planes, which had been transferred to a base at San Jose in the Philippines. As long as they were within cover distance of the air group from the south, everything was as satisfactory as could be expected. But a time would come when they would be vulnerable unless the Japanese Air Force in the Philippines performed better than it seemed at the moment. That afternoon, the light cruiser Noshiro and the cruisers Taka and Atago all reported sightings of submarines, but in each case the sightings turned out to be false alarms. The nervous crew of the Yamato and Mushi also reported sightings of mines, which were equally non-existent. However, the sightings were enough to make anyone nervous, so Admiral Ugaki ordered aerial reconnaissance for the next day. The ship's gunners opened fire from time to time on pieces of flotsam in the water, mistaking them for mines or submarine periscopes. Dedicated or not, the mighty fleet was nervous and remained that way with the coming of darkness. In the afternoon, the air cover from Borneo turned back, and the fleet slowed to 16 knots for the night, zigzagging. By midnight, they were approaching Palawan Passage, where they would soon come under the eyes of 2 American submarines, the Data and the Dace. The first engagement of the great sea battle was about to begin. The Data and Dace had been on patrol for more than 3 weeks. The Data's patrol had begun on September 1st at Brisbane and had not amounted to much. They had been assigned to scout north of Celebes Island during the Palawan and Morai landings and had been unlucky in finding anything. At the end of September, they moved into Mios Wendi for refuelling and minor repairs by the submarine tender Orion. They sailed from this port in back on October 1st, along with the Dace, bound for their respective patrol areas for the forthcoming invasion of the Philippines. At this point in the war, the only method by which American submarines could be assured of relative safety was through the establishment of safety lanes marked out in longitude and latitude on the charts used by ships, planes, and submarines. The submarines were very careful when operating around American bases or within range of land-based air to stay in the safety lanes, but it did not always help much because the planes and ships had eager crews looking for Japanese, and perhaps their navigation was not always perfect. On October 3rd, the Data, while in the safety lane, ran afoul of a hunter-killer group of planes and destroyer escorts. They gave all the proper signals, but had great difficulty convincing the Americans they were friendly. That same day, another submarine in the lane, the Seawolf, disappeared. The Data stayed on the surface, put on all the speed it could manage, and Commander David H. McClintock, its captain, slid away from friendly ships. A few days later, the Data was in its patrol area, extending about 100 miles west of the southern half of Palawan Island and to the northwest coast of Borneo, as far as Brunei Bay. In other words, the Data had been placed by Admiral Christie, commander of the 7th Fleet submarines, in a position where, with a little luck, McClintock might find the big Japanese fleet that was coming to fight the battle. On October 10th, McClintock was joined by the submarine Dace under Commander B.D. Claggett to form a 2-ship wolf pack. For a week they cruised. One convoy escaped them in shallow water for a time, but they managed to sink 2 ships and damage 2. On October 14th, the Data and Dace received orders to cover Balabac Strait and Palawan Passage. They did so until the night of October 18th, when word came about a convoy southbound about halfway up the west coast of Palawan Island. The Data raced north to join the Dace. The 2 captains sighted one another on the morning of October the 19th and moved close enough to hold a megaphone conference. As they were talking, 2 Japanese destroyers suddenly began to bear down on them. The conference was adjourned. The submarines dived hastily, and each captain sent off 4 torpedoes toward the enemy. They were met with embarrassing silence. The Japanese destroyers each dropped a handful of depth charges and then headed off, apparently with more important matters on their minds. This action must have accounted for one of the many submarine sightings the Japanese reported in these days to Admiral Kurita, and also for his realization of what he risked by moving into Palawan Strait. October 20th was a quiet day for the Data and Dace, except for the news of the invasion of the Philippines, which they picked up from a news broadcast. They then headed for Balabac Strait, the shortest distance from Singapore en route to Leyte. They did not know that Kurita had moved to Brunei Bay. At midnight on October 21st, the submarines were in contact with 2 heavy ships and 1 escort northwest of Balabac Strait. The Data began moving in, but the ships went through the dangerous ground at 22 knots, and they got by before the submarine could get into firing position. McClintock tried to guide the Dace into position, but there was no luck. The Japanese made a mighty turn to the west, and at dawn all they could see were mist and northwest, while radar gave a range of more than 20 miles. On the 22nd, as the Japanese moved toward Palawan Passage, the darter and the dace navigated the dangerous ground carefully toward Balabac Strait again. Around midnight, they came close enough so that the captains could have another megaphone talk. Commander Claggett said he was low on fuel and thought it best to leave and head back for replenishment. At that moment, the darter and dace were 50 yards apart, moving slowly at 5 knots on batteries. 2 reports indicated 2 separate convoys moving at about the same time, with the second being an advanced group of 4 destroyers. One of the convoys, bearing to the southwest, had a good chance of getting through the strait without being seen, but as McClintock and Claggett watched, the Japanese force turned to the southeast and showed a battle formation, indicating it was making a serious move toward Leyte in the Philippines. The darter dove and headed toward the approach, and after a time, McClintock managed to get into position to fire the torpedoes. There was some concern about Japanese destroyers dropping depth charges, but the first group of torpedoes fired successfully. The second group of 4 was also launched, with torpedoes coming in for what was hoped to be a successful attack. By dawn, the Japanese, though not knowing exactly what had occurred, must have realized that they were under attack by submarines. The battleships had slowed down and turned toward a new course as the 2 submarines moved in to start attacking again. The battle would be long and fierce. The damage from the torpedoes on the battleships was significant, but this was only the beginning of a dramatic and intense sea battle that was soon to unfold. "I never thought the time would come when I would let 2 heavy cruisers go by," he said, but the larger ship had a definitely heavier superstructure. On the column came, and it was time to fire. He got off the 6 bow tubes, then dived deep, because a battleship was charging down on him. As he dived, he heard 4 of the torpedoes explode. Soon after the torpedo hit, there was a terrific explosion, which was undoubtedly the magazines blowing up. For 25 minutes thereafter, there were terrific breaking up noises that were the most gruesome I have yet experienced in all my patrols. At this time, my engineer officer, Lieutenant Jones, said, "Let's get the hell out of here." I agreed, but I didn't know how to do it. It sounded like she was coming down on top of us, as a matter of fact, and it was one of the worst experiences I have ever had. We received a severe depth charging that kept us deep for several hours. 2 destroyers made perfect runs on us through the hull without the use of sound gear, but for some reason did not drop. The first ship that Commander Mito had selected was indeed the Atago, the fleet flagship. She was particularly notable because while her second funnel was straight, her first was raked sharply back, and her mast was placed just in front of the rear funnel. There was a definite rake to her bridge too, which gave the ship a streamlined appearance. Her overall length was more than 203 meters. She displaced nearly 15,000 tons, was powered by 4 turbines with 12 boilers, and made a speed of 34.2 knots. She bristled with guns, from her 520 centimeters guns to 4,225 mm anti-aircraft guns, and she carried 24 torpedoes and 3 airplanes, except at this point when she had been stripped of her planes for the slender Philippines air defense. All night long, the Japanese had been aware that they were being stalked by submarines. At 2:50 a.m. that morning, Admiral Ugaki had a report that a radio man had overheard a submarine transmitting a special signal on a frequency of 8,470 kilocycles, and the signal was extremely strong, so they knew. But in the restricted waters of Palawan Passage, there was relatively little manoeuvring to be done. Admiral Ugaki, for one, looked for trouble as the dawn came up. Admiral Ugaki was on the bridge of the Yamato, 4th ship in the starboard line of heavy ships. 1 hour before sunrise, the ships had moved into this attenuated formation, specially designed for anti-submarine defense. Their course was 035, and their speed was 18 knots. While Commander Mito would have sworn that the ships were not zigzagging, the formation was doing so, and just before 6:30 a.m., all the ships were beginning a simultaneous turn to port. There was a violent explosion on the port column. It suddenly spied off the port bow on the dawning horizon, the flames from an explosion, and what appeared to be a widening waterspout. Admiral Ugaki briskly ordered an emergency turn to starboard, and in a few moments Admiral Ugaki saw that 2 ships had been hit, and a destroyer had rushed to the side of each to stand by and rescue survivors. Aboard the Atago, the mortal wounds were felt as huge shocks, one after the other. The lookouts estimated, quite wrongly, that the attack had come from nearly 2,000 yards away, and so their fix on the submarine was faulty to begin with. 4 torpedoes hit on the starboard side because of that turn to port in the zigzag pattern, and they were nicely spaced, if you could call it that, forward aid ships and aft. Immediately the ship listed to starboard by about 8 degrees. The captain ordered the counter-flooding of the port engine and boiler rooms, but there was no time. The watertight compartments on the starboard side had been blown right out of her. In a few moments the list increased to 18 degrees and then to 25 degrees. "All hands on deck," ordered the captain, and the men came rushing from the compartments below if they could make their way to the top. The torpedoes had indeed been deadly. The first had struck on the bow in the vicinity of the bread lockers, damaging all the storerooms on the starboard side forward. The officers had ordered the manning of the pumps, but it was a futile gesture. The second torpedo had hit on the side of the No. 1 boiler room. The boiler room had begun to fill with steam, and the damage was so severe that steam and flames began erupting from the air intake on the port side of the bridge and the port and starboard intakes on the middle deck. The junior officers' quarters near the main battery control station began to flood through cracks in the hull that appeared. Now steam pressure fell, the lights flickered, dimmed, and went out. The telephone on the bridge died, and the rest of the ship's telephones were out. The captain had ordered full right rudder, but with the failure of the electrical system, the rudder did not respond. The list increased. The third torpedo entered the No. 6 boiler room with such speed that the voice tube began whistling, and the centre bulkhead between No. 6 and No. 7 boiler rooms cracked, and flames shot through into No. 7. At the same time, the No. 3 torpedo mount directly above the No. 6 boiler room was showered with water and oil spray, and the crew of the mount were blown from their posts to the after control station. The damage was severe. Still, the torpedo officer ordered the jettisoning of torpedoes and heavy objects on the starboard side, and 7 torpedoes went over. The 8th could not be budged. The 4th torpedo came late, after the others had struck, near the after generator room, making a hole in the rear bulkhead of the starboard after engine room. This was a terrible hit. It caused leakage into the after generator room, which flooded almost instantly. The control board room bulkhead cracked, and the men could not stop the flooding. Water entered the starboard shaft alley and the after transformer room. Fuel, oil and water spouted up through the after seamen's compartments. Water flooded into the No. 5 turret powder magazine, and 5 magazine crewmen were killed as that last torpedo struck. The ship's list had increased to 32 degrees. Admiral Kurita and his staff left the flag plot and slid overboard to be rescued by the destroyer Kishin Army, which was standing by, and the assistant medical officer and the chief clerk of the staff were entrusted with the responsibility of transferring the Emperor's picture to the destroyer. They set about their task. The list of the ship was now about 42 degrees to starboard. "Approach the side," was the order to the Kishin Army. "Prepare to lower the ensign," said the captain. As the water entered No. 5 turret, the list increased to 54 degrees. All communications except the voice tube were cut off on the bridge, and the water was lapping just a few feet below the No. 2 turret dome. The order came to abandon ship, and the men who could make it went over the side to be picked up by the Kishin Army and the destroyer Asashio. The cruiser sank, leaving men fluttering in the water, and the destroyers rescued the captain, 43 officers, and 667 petty officers and men. But the chief engineer, 18 officers, and 340 petty officers and men went down with the ship. Before the sinking, the officers on the bridge had destroyed classified materials, code machines and books, either putting them in weighted sacks or locking them in the code rooms. They had moved fast to lock up the map room and ward cabinet. The destroyers stayed in the area searching for any flotsam, but there was nothing important. The Emperor's secrets, his ship, and 359 of his men were deep on the ocean floor below. As to Commander Mito's second target, She was the sister ship of the Otago, the cruiser Takao, and she took 2 torpedoes about a minute after the hits began on the Otago. In spite of the fact that her alert captain had ordered left full rudder seconds before, 1 torpedo struck the starboard side below the bridge, and a second hit below the afterdeck on the same side. The Takao still had her seaplanes aboard, and they were damaged. 1 hole in the hull was nearly 12 x 24 feet, and the second was 12 feet high and nearly 50 feet long. There was considerable physical damage inside, but relatively few casualties. 33 were killed, and about 30 were injured. The ship took a list of 10 degrees to starboard, and the steering went out immediately after the torpedoes struck. The engine slowed and stopped, and she went dead in the water. The captain ordered counter-flooding, and the list decreased. The ship stabilized, and the crew set to work rigging an emergency rudder. The destroyers Asashimo and Naganami came to her side and began an anti-submarine screen operation as the repairs continued. Meanwhile, over in the starboard column of capital ships, the Maya had been torpedoed by Commander Claggett Dace. She was still another sister ship of the Atago and the Takao, fast, modern, and dangerous. The first torpedo hit her on the port side near the chain locker, the second opposite it at the No. 1 gun turret, the third in the No. 7 boiler room, and the last in the port after engine room. The Maya immediately took a sharp list to port and began to break up. Destroyers Akishimo and Kamikaze came alongside as she sank to pick survivors out of the water. For the speed with which she went down, the Japanese were very lucky. Out of a crew of 1,000 officers and men, 769, including the executive officer but not the captain, were saved by the destroyers. All that was done to save lives took place in 4 short minutes. Faced with this disaster, the Japanese fleet held together remarkably well. Although command was not passed at that moment, when Admiral Ugaki ordered his rudder change, the other ships followed. Yet, when the Maya went up, confusion did set in. Admiral Ugaki described it later from his point of view as a senior officer present. Now that Admiral Kurita was drying out on a destroyer with his staff, if other submarines are present, not only would it be dangerous to effect a radical retirement, Ugaki said, but as the senior commander present, a radical separation would not be feasible from the standpoint of visibility. When the Maya went up, he shuddered, for the cruiser was directly in front of his flagship, the Yamato. If the Yamato's position had been a little more one way or the other, she would inevitably have been hit by 3 or 4 torpedoes. This is really dangerous, evading the above sub by turning to starboard and moving up. It was this maneuver that caused the Dace to dive and perhaps saved more of the fleet. Now the Japanese began seeing periscopes everywhere, although both American submarines were on their way to deep water. Admiral Ugaki saw one to port and reversed course. It is no exaggeration to say that for a time the first section was in utter confusion, he said. He was absolutely positive that he saw at least 4 submarines at one time or another, although, of course, only the Data and the Dace were in the area. Gradually the confusion sorted out with no more unpleasant surprises for the Japanese, and Ugaki assumed command. At first he learned only that he was to take over communications command because the Otago was sunk. This came by visual signal at 7 a.m. When he learned that the admiral was safely aboard the Kishin army, he breathed a sigh of relief. Then he learned at 8:30 a.m. that he was to take command. Already he had done so effectively. When he saw the mountains of southern Palawan in the eastern sky, he realized where he was and that only a 20-meter span was available to him between the shallows and reefs of the island and the dangerous ground, much of which was still uncharted. He speeded the fleet to 24 knots. Even though the speed before had been 18 knots, it could not be helped. The signal flags went up and the blinkers began working. By 9:15 a.m., the fleet knew that Ugaki was temporarily, at least, in command. He sent off messages to Combined Fleet and to Tokyo, asking for rescue forces to bring the Takao back to safety and assuring his superiors that the operation would continue in spite of this blow. The busy crew of the Takao began doing what they could to put their ship back into operation. The Naganami and the Asashimo were detached from the fighting force and left behind with her. By 10:50 a.m., the engineers were starting the engines from time to time. At 11 p.m., 5 crewmen who had been blown overboard by the torpedo explosions were returned by the Asashimo, which had rescued them. 40 minutes later, Combined Fleet radioed that help was on the way from Brunei. At noon, the nervous crew of the Takao saw a submarine, but the destroyers could not make any contact with it by 2 p.m. The damage control parties were optimistic that they would be able to bring the ship to port under her own power. It would take a jury-rigged rudder, but the engineers thought it could be done. By 9 p.m., the Takao was moving under her own power, and by midnight she was heading for Brunei at 6 knots, expecting to reach port by midnight 2 days later. Meanwhile, Admiral Ugaki was exercising command. Few Japanese officers were more capable of taking over in an emergency, for Ugaki's experience had been among the greatest in the fleet. At Midway, when he was Chief of Staff after Admiral Yamamoto, he had been instrumental in persuading Yamamoto to retire after the loss of the 4 big carriers, thus probably saving the fleet. He was a man of excellent judgment, but judgment, however, was impaired by necessity this day. He wanted a speed of 24 knots, but soon realized that the fleet would be short of fuel if he did this, and reduced speed to 20 knots. It was this same problem of fuel that had dictated many actions the fleet was taking. For example, the selection of this passage west of Palawan had been caused by fuel problems. The selection of the zigzag method, they had taken the easy zigzag instead of the more expensive complex zigzag. Any commander should have known that he needed a destroyer screen in front of the fleet, particularly when approaching a narrow passage. But there were problems of fuel again. Admiral Ugaki led the fleet through the narrow waters with 3 more submarine scares. Then he changed course to north. At 3:40 p.m., the Kishin army pulled alongside the Yamato. Admiral Kurita and his staff began to transfer from the destroyer to the battleship. At 4:20 p.m., all was done. Admiral Kitt's flag was raised above the battleship, and he took command of the force once again. Ugaki's moment of glory was over. "This, I suppose, is fate," he said. He turned over all responsibility for the battleship division and the fleet, and instructed his staff to do whatever could be done to help Kurita and his men. The force steamed on for San Bernardino Strait. Kurita issued his new orders. The force would rely on sonar searches from sundown until 30 minutes before sunrise. On the morning of October 24th, the Japanese continued moving at 20 knots toward the big battle they expected in less than 48 hours. Meanwhile, the American submarines, which had caused them so much damage, were having new troubles of their own, and very serious ones too. By 8 a.m., the rumpus above had died down enough so that Commander Milto felt it was safe to move up to periscope depth and take a look. He saw the AA, then dead in the water, with planes flying around her and a strong screen of 3 destroyers standing by. He made 2 approaches, but the destroyers drove him off each time. Then he desisted, deciding to wait for night so the tired crew could get some rest. They had been in contact with the Japanese 2 nights in a row now, and many men were exhausted. That night he surfaced after dark within sight of the Tal and made a radio report to Brisbane, where his base was located, telling of the fighting of the morning and the sinking and the composition of the force as best he knew it. The Data and the Dace separated to try and get the crippled Takao when she began to head southwest. The Dace went east to move around the end, and the Data headed west, passing through a large expanse of fuel oil so large it took them an hour to get out of it. At midnight, Commander Milto decided that the time had come to move. He figured he had about an hour to get into position for an attack. It was a pitch-black night, but once in a while they could catch a glimpse of the cruiser wobbling, her speed varying as much as 4 knots, indicating that she was in great difficulty. Lieutenant Ed Skorupski, officer of the deck, and the captain were on the bridge, and they were making 17 knots, hurrying along to get into position. The navigator was plotting in the conning tower, and all officers were at battle stations, although most of the crew except for the watch and plotting party were sound asleep. He later told his story. At about 1:25 a.m., it was now the 24th, we hit a shoal, rowed up over it, taking a large up angle. The officer of the deck and myself thought we were gone. I thought we had been torpedoed. I watched the stern go underwater as far as the engine room hatch. We seemed to be going down quite rapidly. Then, all of a sudden, the stern rode on up, and after several seconds we came to rest high and dry. Still, we couldn't see the reef. After 2 or 3 minutes, we were able to make out that the water was very light-coloured around us. The navigator came running to the bridge. "What was that?" he said. "We are aground." Quick as a flash, he disappeared into the conning tower, apparently to check the chart. Very shortly thereafter, he was back up on the bridge. He said, "Captain, it can't be that we are aground. The nearest land is 19 miles away." Now the Americans began seeing danger. Milto was sure that the Japanese had heard the crash as the ship went on the reef, and he was also sure that one of the destroyer screens was coming over to them. The destroyer moved to within 12,000 yards. That may not sound close, but it sounded close then to us, sitting there on the reef with no arms but one 4-inch gun and a couple of small guns. But the destroyer went about just before high tide, which was to come at 1:40 a.m. Milto knew that he must get off at high tide, or he would not get off at all because they were so close to Palawan that they were within 100 miles of a Japanese airfield at Puerto Princesa. Down on the main deck, there was great activity. The gunners' mates, with some help from the rest of the crew, were throwing all the ammunition overboard except for about 20 rounds, which we were saving for the destroyer at daylight if he should come back. The commissary officer, Don Miller, was busy with part of the crew throwing overboard all of the commissary supplies. The engineer was having all fuel oil and fresh water blown over the side. The torpedo officer was trying to get rid of our torpedoes up forward, but we were afraid to fire them in that position for fear that they would explode as they hit the reef as they dropped from the tubes, and our efforts to get off would have been to no avail. We were not able to get the 6 torpedoes left out of the tubes. By high tide, they had done everything they could think of, and still they were stuck. They tried to back off, but the suction valves were plugged with coral. They could not use the engines. They tried sallying the ship. The crew would run forward and then aft, while the engineering officer ran the battery. No good. So they ordered the Dace to come and rescue them, or rather they made the decision that they would take the Dace's help because they had ordered her up at midnight, just as Dace was getting into position to torpedo the Takao once again. The Dace had broken off her approach, a heart-breaking decision, and had come to the rescue. By 2:30 a.m., with a falling tide, the tops of the screws of the darter were thrashing air. They were that dry, and Milto gave up. Down below, activities of another nature were going on. All equipment down below was being destroyed. In the conning tower, the TDC was being wrecked with a sledgehammer, also the radars. In the forward battery, particularly in the officer shower, fires were burning where all registered publications were being destroyed. After I gave up trying to get her off, I had little to do except walk around down below to see what was going on. The air down below was so full of smoke that, in fact, it was all I could do to stay down there more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. I remember seeing one mess attendant, a 6-footer named Lewis, who was having the time of his life. He had a sledgehammer, and he was destroying things, and he really was enjoying it. At about 3 a.m., they began to abandon ship, moving to the newly arrived Dace. Claggett brought the Dace right up to the edge of the shoal, so close that Milto worried about him and kept telling him through the megaphone to get clear. But Claggett held the ship close to the reef, sent a line from the bow to the darter's stern, and managed to stay 50 yards off the stern of the darter. Ernie Schwab, executive officer of the darter, was on the stern directing the abandonment of the ship. By this time, 3 a.m., the tide was so low that there was a 20-foot drop from the fantail to the life rafts. Luckily, the waves were not severe. Finally, they were all off the ship except for the gunnery officer, the executive officer, the chief of the boat, one gunner's mate, and the captain. The enlisted men were rigging charges under direction of the gunner's mate, who was a little worried because he had never done any demolition work, and he wasn't quite sure he was doing it correctly. They set the charges at 4:30 a.m. The captain wanted to be last off the ship, but was persuaded that this was no time for protocol and went off next to last. The gunnery officer was the last off. The Dace's deck was so crowded with men that Schwab, the executive officer, kept ordering men below, worrying about an enemy plane or ship coming along at this critical time and catching them in this helpless position. But everything went well. The Americans lost only their ship and all of their clothing except for shorts, shoes and socks, and a few other items, such as watches, which they had taken with them. They felt the loss badly and saw the ship sink with their own eyes and had hoped to torpedo her, but it was now daylight and they had to make time getting away. They went back to the general area of their patrol for a few hours and began to return to Fremantle in Australia. This time they had a second-hand experience of enemy attacks and dangers, but all crewmen arrived safely in Fremantle on the 31st of October 1944. In the Inner Empire, there was another submarine alert after 4 a.m. on October 22nd. The ships were steaming in night formation when they changed the zigzag pattern, increased speed for evasive action, and the Zuikaku, Zuo, spotted a periscope, or so her lookouts claimed. Sirens rang, and the ships went to battle stations. 7 search planes were launched at 5:49 a.m., and before they were recovered, another search was put up at 11:53 a.m. Someone swore they saw a torpedo track off the Zuikaku's port side. The fleet went to battle stations again, but it was a false alarm. The young men flying the planes did their best despite inadequate training. At noon, one of the planes came in hard on the Zuikaku and smashed up during landing. This reduced the Ozawa Air Force to 115 fighting planes, plus a few float planes on the cruisers. Ozawa refueled his fleet, moving at 16 knots the rest of the afternoon, heading south, then southeast towards the northern tip of Luzon. That afternoon and evening, the ships were particularly alert for submarines, hoping to engage Admiral Hall's 3rd Fleet carrier forces. At 8 p.m., the cruiser Tama's lookouts thought they saw torpedo tracks again. The destroyer Wakatsuki spent a long time depth-charging the empty sea. The next morning, on October 23rd, the Isuzu reported a submarine threat, and at 5 a.m. the fleet went to battle stations once again. The Zuikaku captain ordered a hard right rudder, changed the zigzag pattern, and launched planes. On the morning of October 23rd, the Ozawa fleet was directly east of Formosa, heading southwest when a plane in the search pattern reported an unidentified aircraft 60 miles ahead of the formation. They went to battle stations again, but it was another false alarm. By 11 p.m., Admiral Ozawa admitted he was puzzled. He did not know where the enemy was. Early in the afternoon, the Zuikaku's lookouts claimed to see another periscope. Despite no real threat, the fleet responded with a search and evasive actions. At 4 p.m., the Zuikaku's radio announced a message from the Americans, indicating their nearness to the American fleet. It was frustrating to be so near yet so far. Ozawa wanted to engage the American fleet and keep them busy long enough for Kurita's forces to act. By dawn on October 25th, Ozawa hoped the time for action was near. Another submarine scare occurred at 5:30 p.m., and Ozawa made preparations for engagement, ordering the fleet to make 24 knots and be ready for 30 knots within an hour. This put a strain on the fleet's oil supply, but it was essential for high-speed maneuvers. That night, as the fleet steamed towards Luzon, they picked up another radio broadcast, believed to be a submarine making contact with its base. Another submarine contact came 3 hours later. Ozawa knew he was moving into the action zone and would be ready for anything the next morning. On the morning of October 22nd, the escort carriers of the 7th Fleet fueled and launched their morning strikes against Japanese airfields. Rear Admiral T.L. Sprague's careful planning ensured the men knew why they were fighting and what was happening in the Philippines operation. He emphasized the growth of the Imperial Japanese Navy and its threats. The escort carriers, divided into 3 groups, remained vigilant. The destroyer Edmonds reported a sound contact ahead of her carrier at 8 a.m. on October 23rd. The Edmonds found nothing after searching the area, concluding it was likely a school of fish. The escort carrier pilots noticed an increase in Japanese planes, indicating the Japanese were pulling in a lot of planes. On October 23rd, the escort carriers hit Japanese fields on the Visayas, Mindoro and Negros, destroying planes on the ground and encountering Japanese fighters. That evening, the carriers kept their planes in the air to protect the beaches and ships in the harbour. Rear Admiral T.L. Sprague ensured his men understood the significance of their mission. On the night of October 23rd, American PT boats patrolled to guard the approaches to Leyte Gulf and attack enemy vessels. PT 1228, commanded by Lieutenant G.J. Azarian, and PT 1230, patrolled the coast and engaged enemy barges, damaging and sinking several. They expended a significant amount of ammunition, but successfully prevented enemy reinforcements from reaching Leyte. Admiral Kinkaid was uneasy with the Japanese threats, but had positioned his forces effectively. Task Force 38 conducted searches on October 22nd and 23rd without positive results. Admiral Halsey's staff estimated possible enemy actions and prepared for countermeasures. By the night of the 23rd, it was apparent that the Japanese were planning something significant. On October 23rd, Halsey extended the search into the Sibuyan Sea and waters west of Luzon. Submarine reports indicated Japanese movements, and Kinkaid warned MacArthur, Halsey, Nimitz, and Admiral King about the Japanese threat. Task Force 38 prepared to reinforce searches and anticipated large-scale enemy actions. Admiral Kinkaid approved Halsey's disposition of carriers, ensuring they were ready for the upcoming challenges. By October 23rd, both Japanese and American fleets were on high alert, preparing for significant engagements. The Japanese hoped to draw the American fleet into action, while the Americans focused on preventing Japanese reinforcements and maintaining control over the Philippines operation. It is extremely important that early preparations for enemy operations be disrupted. The 5th Air Force and 13th Air Force requested continued thorough reconnaissance of Coron Bay and approaching routes, and to strike as practicable, day and night. The 3rd Fleet requested a strike on Coron Bay at the earliest practicable time, and to extend the search as far as practicable to the westward and northwestward. The primary objective was enemy combat ships and aircraft. It was possible that enemy carriers would support surface forces and strike from the west on Palawan. As far as Coron Bay was concerned, Holly was already on record as ordering a strike as quickly as possible. He still thought it possible to continue with the plan, letting McCain's group reach Ulithi and rearm and rest until October 29th. Not long after receiving Kinkaid's worried message about the build-up, Holly heard from the 5th Bomber Command that one of their planes had sighted 4 destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers, and a light cruiser. Was this still another force? Holly continued his planning for strikes on Luzon and Lingayen Gulf using Admiral Sherman's force for the purpose, but the aerial search reports continued to be negative, while the submarine reports became ever more exciting that afternoon and evening. There was talk of the DA's sinking of her heavy ship, the Bream's exploit off Manila, and then the Data's message about the Kurita force. The night carrier Independence was ordered to launch night search planes, but tomorrow would tell the tale. On October 23rd, while the Americans were searching out the Japanese fleet and finding 3 of the units that were at sea, at least tentatively, the Japanese air forces in the Philippines were preparing for their big effort. According to the show plan, the land-based air forces would exert maximum effort beginning on the morning of October 24th. The 2nd Air Fleet had been fed down from Formosa for that purpose, a group of 196 planes of all kinds. The Japanese air commanders were well aware of the importance of their mission. The success or failure of this attack was to have a tremendous effect upon the breakthrough of the naval surface units into Leyte Bay. The Japanese were not in a position for several days to conduct the most effective air searches, pinned down as they were by the planes from the 3rd Fleet and the escort carriers, and holding their air strength until the last. Thus, between October 20th and 23, the Japanese were unaware of the whereabouts of Admiral Hai and his fleet, but at night on the 23rd it was imperative that they know. The Japanese commander, Admiral Sharo Fukudomi, ordered night search by flying boats and 2 waves of dawn scouts. The pilots were told to be ready to man their planes at dawn. Just after midnight, the Japanese sighted a large force of ships at 90 degrees, some 250 miles off Manila, and Fukui decided to launch a pre-dawn attack. The weather was vile, but there was nothing else to be done. It was imperative, in fact, that the Americans be destroyed. The planes took off in 2 waves and attacked, but the weather stopped them, and only one bomber even caught sight of a ship before they were forced to turn around and go home. At 6:30 a.m., the attacks resumed, and this time the Japanese found 3 groups of Task Force 38 lined up along the eastern shore of the Philippines, 150 to 200 miles from shore. They moved in to attack, and the aerial battle began. Here is the way the Japanese saw the battle. At 8:53 a.m., a group of surface craft with 4 regular aircraft carriers and 2 light aircraft carriers as its nucleus was discovered at 80 degrees, 60 miles off Manila. At 9 a.m., another group with 2 carriers was found 50 to 60 miles north of the first group. At 9:40 a.m., the third group with 3 aircraft carriers was spotted east of the San Bernardino Strait. The first and second waves of attack planes converged upon the first group of surface craft and made a direct hit with 250-kilogram bombs on a large regular carrier. They set fire to 1 battleship, inflicted considerable damage to a cruiser, and shot down at least 32 enemy planes. Our losses were 67 planes missing. The third 3 carrier bombers took off in the afternoon, but returned due to bad weather. Following this, 24 planes in 3 groups took to the air in search of the enemy's third group with carriers. What had actually happened was that the Japanese, during the day, did damage to the destroyer Leiter, the oiler Ashtabula and landing ship tank 552, and caused the sinking of the light carrier Princeton. Thus, the Japanese claims were not so ridiculous, giving them credit for mistaking a destroyer for a battleship. In fact, they did more damage than they claimed. The story of the Princeton and the Japanese attack is a sad but poignant one. It shows the bravery of the enemy, his luck for a moment, and the bad luck of the American forces. The morning had begun with dawn search teams launched by the American carriers. They headed south and then spread out to cover the west side of the island of Luzon, the Sulu Sea, which lies between Borneo and the Philippines. All 3 task groups had been pulled back toward the Philippine coast. Now Admiral Sherman was to the north with the Princeton and his other carriers just off Luzon. Meanwhile, Admiral Bogan was near San Bernardino Strait, and Admiral Davidson's force was south of that off Leyte Gulf. All carriers began flying searches that morning. Just after 8 a.m., a plane from Bogan's Intrepid found Admiral Kay's force in the Sulu Sea. 10 minutes later, Admiral Holly had the information. The alert was on in flag plot. The words became crisp, and the thought was about the strikes to be made at the enemy force. It would all be done by air. It must be remembered that the seas around the Philippines had been Japanese waters since 1942 and were presumed to be mined effectively. The Americans had discovered in the invasion of Leyte that this was true. Thus, although it would seem a simple matter for the battleships and cruisers to move into San Bernardino Strait and trap the oncoming Japanese, Admiral Nimitz had issued orders that no ships were to go into the strait without his express permission. While the Americans were preparing to launch their strikes against the enemy, the Japanese were coming in on Sherman's force. This also happened to be the force in which Admiral Mitcher was riding in the Lexington, his flagship. During the night of October 23rd to 24, those Japanese flying boats had effectively spotted the task group and were almost constantly over it. Tracking night fighters were put up and kept the Japanese at a distance, but they had no intention of attacking. Their mission was to observe. A night fighter shot down one snooper at 2:27 a.m., but they kept on buzzing around. Just before 6 a.m., the radar screens showed 5 separate observation planes at different points on the screens. The enemy, said Admiral Sherman, was evidently well aware of our position, at least of our task group, if not of the others. He was aware of the others, and yet Sherman's force was to bear the brunt of the big air strike called under the show operation. At dawn, Sherman's carriers launched their searches. The planes, fighters, and dive bombers were armed with bombs, and in addition, the decks of the carriers were now crowded with torpedo bombers waiting for news of the enemy so they might strike. Operations began at 5:20 a.m. with a call to general quarters, and plans were made for a long, dangerous, and tiring day. Breakfast was prepared and served at battle stations. The sun rose that morning at 6:46 a.m. Already the Essex and the Lexington had launched their searches, which were to fan out 300 miles and report. The Langley was responsible for anti-snooper patrol and anti-submarine patrol, and she launched those forces plus a 4-plane combat air patrol that would circle over the task group. The Essex also launched a 20-plane fighter sweep that was sent against Japanese airfields around Manila. The Princeton's responsibility, which she fulfilled, was to launch a force of 8 fighters for the combat air patrol. The Japanese spotter planes were swarming around the carrier force by this time. By 7:50 a.m., the combat air patrol planes from the Langley had shot down 2 Japanese snoopers, and the Princeton's planes shot down 2 more. At about 7:50 a.m., the search radar picked up a large force of Japanese planes stacked in the air from 25,000 feet on down. The Japanese were about 75 miles west of the task group. First came the report of one enemy group and then a report of a second. It was an exciting moment because the Japanese planes were discovered just after a contact report from search planes, which indicated the presence of Kurita's force in the Sulu Sea. Admiral Sherman was ready to send his torpedo planes against these forces, so they were on deck. Then he had to put up more fighters to join the combat air patrol from the carriers. That was the next order of business. The planes in the air were directed toward the enemy, and then the Langley and the Princeton each launched a dozen more fighters, and the Essex launched 7. It was not enough. A few minutes later, even more Japanese planes were spotted coming in from the west, 60 miles away. At 8:31 a.m., the Lexington launched her remaining dozen fighter planes. The Japanese, by coming in such strength, had already accomplished one thing. They delayed the Sherman force. What was now at stake was the life of the group, and Sherman prepared for radical sea maneuvers. Fortunately, the weather was very spotty, and he could run in and out of a number of rain squalls in the vicinity. It was in the squall to escape the Japanese, out to launch and recover, and back in again. "We were kept pretty busy with the attack for the next several hours," said Admiral Sherman. The first planes headed toward the enemy, and soon the radar screens on the ships became confused. The largest raid of all was the third reported, and Commander David McCampbell, the Essex Air Group commander, took on this one. McCampbell had been spotted in his fighter plane on the catapult fueling for the strike against the Sulu Sea force of Admiral Kurita. He was to lead the fighters, but with the coming in of this third force of enemy planes, Admiral Sherman's orders changed all that. McCampbell said, "We got word of this raid coming in. It had already closed to about 45 miles, and so I was launched in a scramble. In other words, we scrambled all the fighters who were available at that particular time. We got 7 off, even though his plane was not completely full of gas. McCampbell took off and headed toward the enemy. They intercepted them about 30 miles from their own ships. The Japanese had altitude on them at the time. About the time they sighted them, the Japanese started to turn to the left, apparently searching or having overshot the position they thought we were in. We never figured out why they turned to the left," McCampbell said. "Anyway, when we hit them as they were making their left turn, they continued on, the bombers on through the overcast. Our second combat team was to hit the stragglers, or the bombers, and I told them that I would take my combat team up and start from the top and work down. Due to a mix-up in the communications there, we had to shift channels after we got off. 5 of them went down on the bombers, and that left only my wingman and me up topside. When the bombers went through the overcast, the 5 went after them. I think they got 12 or 13 planes out of that. The Japanese fighters went into a flurry circle. There were about 40 of them, and it's a pretty difficult sort of thing. We didn't even attempt to make a run while they were in this big flurry circle, but we had altitude on them. We just circled over them and watched them and waited for them to make a move. McCampbell's wingman was Lieutenant Roy Rushing. McCampbell called him on the radio and told him, "I thought that they must be running out of gas pretty soon, and I knew that we had plenty of gas, so they'd have to head somewhere, and that's when we would work them over." They circled for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and then headed for Manila. These were the fighters. Only the bombers had all scattered and had been pretty well taken care of. I followed them back to Manila, where we engaged for about an hour and 35 minutes. After much screaming for help, we finally got another man to assist us. Unfortunately, he ran out of ammunition and had to return to the ship. The ship didn't support us because they were preparing for another major raid and had launched the rest of their fighters for the second raid. Roy and I decided to wait for an opportunity. We watched as the enemy fighters maintained good formation and used tactics similar to ours. Our familiarity with these tactics made it easier for us. We bided our time, and I don't think any of them ever managed to get a shot at us. Together, Roy and I shot down 15 of them and burned 15 more, claiming a few additional probables as we saw them smoke and pull away. We followed them all the way back into Manila. When they dove through the clouds to their fields, we were very low on fuel and out of ammunition, so we decided it was time to head home. I returned to our own ship, but the deck was spotted for takeoff and couldn't take me aboard, so I had to land on one of the other carriers. I had only 6 gallons of gas and 2 rounds of ammunition left when I got back. Roy had a little more fuel. While the fighters were doing their job, the task group manoeuvred in and out of rain squalls, making us a very elusive target for the Japanese. By 8:45 a.m., the second enemy air attack had been broken up, and Admiral Sherman ordered the carriers to prepare to strike against the Japanese ships as quickly as possible. The Japanese forces were scattered, and only occasional loners showed up on radar, with only one within 25 miles of the formation. By 9 a.m., the carriers were busy recovering fighters that were as low on fuel and ammunition as McCampbell had been. He landed on the Langley, while others landed elsewhere. The Princeton and the other carriers moved to a course of 065 degrees into the wind at 24 knots to begin flight operations. 6 of the Princeton's loaded torpedo bombers were moved to the hangar deck and spotted in a 4&D line on the port side. The Princeton recovered 10 fighters and was preparing to recover 2 more. The gasoline detail was fueling the planes, and everything was moving smoothly. At 9:12 a.m., the Essex reported a possible bogey about 6 miles to the northwest. Otherwise, life was very quiet for a carrier landing shot-up planes, some of which were bearing wounded men. At 9:35 a.m., a single Japanese plane was spotted through the hazy clouds, diving in on the Princeton at a shallow angle. The 20 mm and 40 mm anti-aircraft guns of the Princeton and the ships around her began to open fire. At 9:38 a.m., the mobile came on the talk between ships circuit, and a dive bomber reported 160 in a dive. The Princeton did not hear the transmission because the noise from the anti-aircraft fire was intense. The forward batteries fired as rapidly as possible, and Captain W. Baraka ordered the quartermaster to steer 20 degrees left to avoid the bomber. However, the plane continued its attack and dropped a 250 kilograms bomb about 75 feet forward of the after elevator on the port side of the ship. The plane passed over and was shot down by American fighters. When the bomb hit, Captain Baraka was not overly worried, thinking it was a small bomb, and that his damage control men could patch the hole and resume flight operations quickly. However, the bomb exploded directly through one of the 6 loaded torpedo planes in the hangar deck below and caused a massive explosion between the hangar and the second deck. Flames shot down into the engineering space and then back into the hangar, spreading immediately. Thick black smoke began issuing from the edges of the forward elevator and from every access to the hangar deck. The general announcing circuit warned of the fire in the hangar deck. The captain called radar plot on the command circuit to reach the executive officer, but the officer had already left his station to attend to the fire below decks. The bomb hit had not been considered very serious initially. It was felt as a dull jar. The first lieutenant did not receive any immediate report from any station on deck or from any repair party. The first lieutenant ordered the conflagration station to turn on the hangar sprinkling system, but there was no positive confirmation that it had been done. The personnel in the station requested permission to abandon their post due to the intense heat. A sailor in an asbestos suit tried to help, but found the heat so intense that the sweat inside his suit turned to steam. The entire deck was soon engulfed in flames, with all 6 torpedo bombers on fire, each loaded with torpedoes and full gasoline tanks. A water hose was brought out, but the pressure failed. Lieutenant O'Hare, the hangar deck officer, went to the fire station on the port side and turned on the pressure for 2 hoses, but found the control switches smoking and telephone lines overwhelmed by smoke. On the bridge, Captain Baraka reported to Admiral Sherman that the ship had taken a bomb and promised to keep him informed. The ship was making 24 knots, and Sherman asked if the Princeton wanted to slow down. The captain consulted the chief engineer, who said it was not necessary. The engineering plant was in good condition, though it was getting smoky down there. One of the issues from the beginning was the impairment of the fire main pressure caused by the electrical systems in the hangar sprinklers shorting out. Commander J.N. Murphy, the executive officer, found it nearly impossible to get into the hangar and tried to operate the sprinklers manually from the 3rd deck, but there was still no pressure. Gas tanks and ammunition began exploding, and communication failures delayed the captain's awareness of the situation. The captain eventually slowed to 18 knots and was prepared to stop if necessary. His priority was to evacuate men from below before they were overcome by heat and smoke. Repair officers Lieutenant Carson and Enan Christie continued to work to open valves that would divert water into the sprinkling system and hoses. The damage included a flash fire that entered the after-engine room through the vent ducts, burning the chief of the watch. Within 1 minute of the bomb hit, the forward engine room was filling with smoke to the point of suffocation and darkness. All hands were ordered to put on gas masks. Explosions from the planes in the hangar could be heard, and the heat on the flight deck became unbearable. Lieutenant Commander Curtis, the assistant air officer, took shelter under the platform and eventually retreated to the fantail. At 9:41 a.m., Admiral Sherman asked how many planes were in the air. The answer was 10, so Sherman began coordinating with other ships in the task group. The Lexington could take 6 planes, and they were sent to the other carriers. There were many acts of heroism. A carpenter's mate went below into the smoke to try to start fire pumps, but found the power out. The chief engineer informed the captain that controlling the fire was becoming increasingly difficult, but they would continue working. The worst issue was the loss of contact with the after-fire room. The first lieutenant, busy assessing the damage, did not have time to provide a detailed report. 10 minutes after the Japanese bomb struck, men were going over the side to escape the intense heat. Lieutenant Commander Curtis suggested that if the ship could be turned out of the wind, it might help reduce the heat. Captain Baraka agreed, and the Princeton changed course. The cruiser Reno and the destroyers Gatling, Irwin, and Cassin Young stayed with the burning carrier while the rest of the task group continued their operations. The Princeton began to move on her new course, coming very close to the South Dakota, which cleared her path. As the ship moved, the engine room began to clear of smoke, providing some satisfaction to the captain. Men below reported that the bilges were filling with hot water from the firefighting, increasing the heat in the engine room to the point where men were beginning to pass out. The battle dressing stations in sick bay were also filling with smoke, forcing doctors and corpsmen to abandon the area. At 9:56 a.m., steering control in the pilot house failed, and steering was shifted to the after station with the captain controlling from the bridge. There was no smoke in the steering aft because the vent had been shut off. On the flight deck, men were pushing planes overboard, and soon 5 fighters were slipped into the sea. The gasoline was drained from the planes and dropped back into storage without trouble. Gasoline on deck never became a significant problem, but there were plenty of other problems. SN Captain Burer watched from his bridge as they developed. It was exactly 2 minutes past 10 when the first major explosion occurred. This explosion came from the torpedoes, which were mounted in the planes in the hangar. These explosions were severe. The first one was AF and blew out the after elevator. Shortly thereafter, there was another explosion forward in the hangar. About 5 minutes after 10, the forward elevator was knocked out, creating a hole in the flight deck between the elevators. Practically the entire flight deck between the elevators was buckled upward. Before the forward elevator was knocked out, I could see from the ship control station in the island structure the smoke and raging fire in the hangar. But the elevator, flush with the flight deck, kept the smoke from coming up to the bridge. When the forward elevator was knocked out, it released the smoke and fire to come up the island structure. I then had to take steps to get the personnel out of the island. Those explosions always caused a number of flying fragments. There were some casualties on the bridge, and one signalman was so seriously injured that he died before we could get him off the ship. Captain Baraka told the people on the bridge to abandon ship. They moved down over the forward part of the bridge onto the crane and then down onto the flight deck forward. They could not climb down the ladders and companionways because of the smoke and heat. He also ordered the chief engineer to secure below and get all personnel on deck. "All hands topside," went the call over the general announcing system. The captain could only hope that every station would hear. Baraka met Commander Murphy, the executive officer, on the forward part of the flight deck, and said it was time to execute salvage control Phase 1. This meant that most of the crew would abandon ship, and only those necessary to fight the fire would remain, plus a few to man the guns. As soon as he saw the explosions tearing the Princeton, Admiral Sherman detailed the cruiser Birmingham to join the standby party. The Princeton had moved about 5 miles astern of the task group by this time, and now the good reason for the heavy screen could be seen. A Japanese air raid began, and as the fighters scrambled, it became apparent that there was a problem. The Princeton had been responsible for the combat air patrol that morning. With her out of action, the air patrol was diminished, and 2 Japanese fighters got through the air screen and began to approach the Princeton. Admiral Carney referred to it as the airman's instinct. The Reno's anti-aircraft guns began to pound, and they shot down the Japanese planes that were moving in. Captain Thomas B. Englis was in command of the Birmingham, and as the senior officer present, he was in command now of the ships trying to help the Princeton. When I found myself as the senior officer present of this group, I instructed the destroyers to concentrate on recovering the Princeton's personnel. The Princeton had abandoned ship, except for the captain and perhaps 40 or 50 men. At the time we were approaching Princeton, there were something over 1,000 men in the water. I also instructed the Reno to circle this group to provide anti-aircraft and anti-submarine protection to the limit of her ability. The Reno was an anti-aircraft cruiser with an unusually good battery of anti-aircraft weapons, and was also equipped with submarine sound detection gear and depth charges, making her quite effective.